Hello, and on today's video, I'm going to talk about the big three writers from Weird Tales: Clark Ashton Smith, H.P. Lovecraft, and Robert E. Howard. I'm going to just talk about them off the top of my head. Just bring up mostly their horror stuff right now. It's just what I feel like talking about, and it's basically like the Appendix N. I talk about a lot of the Appendix N stuff from that it was influence on old school Dungeons and Dragons and should remain influence on everybody. I love a lot of that stuff, but especially I do love the big three. I'm probably the biggest fan of the probably a bigger fan of the big three than I am of any other Appendix N things, even over and above Tolkien. I prefer Weird Tales to Tolkien. I like Tolkien a lot, but I prefer the Weird Tale stuff, and I prefer the Weird Tale stuff to Michael Moorcock or Paul Anderson or a lot of the other Fritz Leiber. Not that I dislike the people I just mentioned, but I have read a lot of H.P. Lovecraft, a lot of Robert E. Howard, and a lot of Clark Ashton Smith. And to me, they are far bigger influences on me than any movie has ever been. Um, they are a big part of how I view the settings and the world that I create for my campaigns. In many ways, H.P. Lovecraft, Clark Ashton Smith, and Robert E. Howard are my biggest influences. And I'm just, and as an example here is Rendezvous at Avignon in a classic Arkham House hardback edition. This is quite old. I got this actually. I think I got this one for Christmas um, as a gift, obviously, and it has a lot of stuff in it. It has not just his Avignon stories, as you can see here from the title page here. It has it has tales of Atlantis, has tales of Avignon, has tales of Hyperborea, has tales of his Lost Worlds writing and Zothique. Uh, and I think overall, I like his Zothique stuff the best for the most part. Not that his writing has a great variance in style. I love his his necromancers. I love his wretched dooms for his characters who die under circumstances that they often very well deserve, dooms they've earned, dooms that they have very much earned by their callousness, by their by their arrogance, by their ignorance, by their ambition. Characters like the character in the like characters in his in the Ice Demon, which is not actually in that collection I just showed you, but it's an excellent one. Uh, characters very much. Sometimes every now and then though, probably my favorite single story by him is the Charnel Gods, the Charnel God, which actually has the main protagonist not falling and dying at the end, but actually rescuing his beloved. Spoiler on a 90-year-old story, but the good guy wins at the end, which is actually unusual for Mr. Clark Ashton Smith. Clark Ashton Smith is probably the one I have is probably my least favorite of the three. He is definitely seen. He's definitely not as popular as the other two, even now. At the time, I don't think he was even quite as popular. Um, my feelings about him is that his ironic detachment uh, just doesn't fit with my preferred. I prefer earnestness over irony. Uh, it's perfectly fine to be ironic, and he is an excellent He's an excellent poet, and the poetry shows up in his work, but it does for Robert E. Howard too. And Robert E. Howard is, psychotically earnest. Uh, his his work is, I think, quite good though. I'm trying to think of any story by him that I really don't like. But the main one was big. One of the big issues is it's not. I just don't think of his writing as being quite as memorable as H.P. Lovecraft and Robert E. Howard. And I've been reading Clark Ashton Smith since I was in high school. I've been reading Robert E. Howard was the earliest. I was reading him early in high school, but of course I was reading comic books, the Conan comics, especially Savage Sword of Conan, which is, I mean, obviously it's not Robert E. Howard, but Savage Sword of Conan really captured his spirit pretty well by the time I was 10 or 11 years old. Same thing with Conan the Barbarian comic books, and but it was after high school that I really started getting into Robert E. Howard's horror short stories. It was actually a copy of Wolf's Head that had an introduction by Robert Bloch, who writes the introduction to the next book I'm about to show you. There was an introduction to him where he kind of shits on Robert E. Howard for his Conan stories and praises his horror stories. And Conan is a huge influence on me. Conan is and Conan's the world of the world of Hyboria does have very strong influence. I mean, as a creator of fantasy worlds, I would say Robert E. Howard at least equals Tolkien in terms of influence. I admit Howard is not the grand designer of an incredibly unique universe the way Tolkien is, but 90% of fantasy writers, 90% of the times you come across fantasy campaigns, there's fantasy France or fantasy England, fantasy Huns or Mongols, fantasy Egypt, fantasy, all this stuff. And what is Hyboria but, an excuse? It was really an excuse so that Conan could face Vikings and pirates, and like pirates of the Spanish Main. He could face Vikings, and he could face the Mongols, and he could have adventures in a high medieval setting, and he could travel to exotic tropical locations, like something out of H. Rider Haggard Lost World stories. And Robert E. Howard's the big advantage he has over either Lovecraft or Clark Ashton Smith is in his characters. His larger than life, absolutely larger than life characters. Conan being obviously the most famous. I think that was even true at the time, but even Breckenridge Elkins is pretty much a bigger than life character, and very much a character that is very influential on his horror stories. Is that fellow right there, Solomon Kane. Solomon Kane, his influence through Solomon Kane is gigantic on Games Workshop's Warhammer, both Warhammer and Warhammer 40K. Witch Hunters, the appearance of the Witch Hunters in both settings is very much based on our friend here, the great Solomon Kane. Solomon Kane also is a gigantic influence on it was a gigantic influence on me. When I first came across his stories, I loved Solomon Kane. I came across Solomon Kane, I have to admit, in Savage Sword of Conan first. They had little stories that had some of his stuff in Savage Sword of Conan. But I love that character right away. He's not quite as superhuman as Conan, and he is more driven and more fanatical than in most of his other characters. I love Solomon Kane. Solomon Kane's meets a dying woman. I mean, the first story, he meets a woman who's dying, and he swears eternal revenge against this woman who's been murdered. He didn't witness the murder. He has no personal connection to her, and he decides to hunt the Slayer across the entire planet, catching up to him in darkest Africa and killing him. That is probably my favorite. That's probably one of the best stories he wrote. And then his horror stories in general are fantastic. Whether it's Pigeon from Hell or my favorite of his, one of my two favorites are though, what is it? Not People of the Monolith. It's the Black Stone. People of the Monolith is the poem that happens in universe, and of course, Fires of Ashurbanipal, which is basically a classic like H. Rider Haggard, Lost Mines of Solomon adventure, only with a Cthulhu monster at the end instead of, and it's fantastic. Robert E. Howard writes with such fire, and his characters are so human. That's why he's probably overall my favorite writer of the three. There's almost no question about that. He's just so much fun to write. But when he's off his game, or when he's just phoning it in, he is just phoning it in sometimes, and that doesn't really happen as much. It doesn't seem like to me Clark Ashton Smith ever phoned it in. He may not have been he may not have been at his very most inspired, but he was always trying to do something interesting. And Lovecraft always seemed to be at pretty much at the same level. The variance to me in his stories, especially in both of his horror stories and even in his fantasy stories, the difference in quality between them is tiny. But his characters are not as memorable as Howard's, and he's not quite the polished stylist that Clark Ashton Smith is. But of course, what Lovecraft is most known for are these stories. This collection right here probably has all of his very best in them. Let's see, should have a contents page. There it is. I don't know why I can find that, but Rats in the Walls, all the way to Shadow Out of Time. Shadow Out of Time being probably the only one in this series, this collection, that is more science fiction than horror. But it does end with a sort of horror event, but Lovecraft is the thing about Lovecraft is he sets out to create an effect. That's always the way he describes it. He's setting out to create an effect in the people reading his stories. He's trying to, and he has a similar style with all of the stories, where he creates an event, describes it, and takes slowly away all the mundane explanations for what's going on, until you're left with the creepy horror supernatural explanation, or preternatural explanation, which might be a more appropriate way to put it. So I think Lovecraft's the most consistent, is the more consistent than the other two. But he also, but Howard, probably the most talented. And those are, that's why I prefer those two. I would love to have seen Robert E. Howard live another 50 years to see what he would have done. He probably would have spent the rest of the 30s, 40s and maybe well into the 50s. He may have well have ended up in the 1950s if he not killed himself. He may well have ended up um, being a writer for television or something, which to me seems somewhat disappointing. Um, but thinking about that, but maybe he also would have become a great novelist or something. I think it would have worked. The reason why I think it would have worked in television because westerns are so huge on television, and his writing, he might have well have ended up writing for Stagecoach, Gunsmoke, and Wagon Train, and the Rifleman, and all these things. I could see him doing that. He would not have been adverse to that, but I also could have seen him going on to write westerns, and then to found out how really popular his fantasy stuff, and going back to fantasy, writing just to make money, working for television and stuff like that, and then being no big success there, and then suddenly in the '60s his fantasy writing come back to the fore, and I think he would have had a revival, and he probably would have written a new Conan stories just because the demand would have been there. Once the '70s came up, he probably would, if he'd have lived to be 80 years old, which means he would have died in 1986. He would almost certainly have written Conan stories. I think that's my personal view, and I would love to have seen that. But we only got 30 years of him, and he wrote an awful lot of good stories. And both Lovecraft and Clark Ashton Smith are older men than him, uh, and both of them outlived him, though Lovecraft only by a year. But Lovecraft, or would never have been a work for hire. He would not have been a writer on a TV show, unless, of course, I don't know. I guess maybe there's a chance he could have been hired by Twilight Zone, but he was not a great writer of dialogue. None of these three actually were great writers of dialogue, but it doesn't matter. They were writing excellent stories. When it comes to gaming, the three are such a huge influence on Dungeons and Dragons. The spirit of Dungeons and Dragons is very much a combination of Fritz Leiber, Jack Vance, and Robert E. Howard. Those three really, really, really set the tone. They're kind of the Wild West frontier type fantasy is Robert E. Howard. The Beyond the Black River is an American style going beyond the frontier type adventure. It absolutely is. The Picts are the stand-ins for the Indians, and the Aquilonians are clearly stand-ins for American manifest destiny. So his influence was huge there. But he had a tendency towards, kind of having, giant spiders, giant apes, and giant ape men, and giant ape men. Or was it spiders, ape men, and serpents? Those were his big monster, his big go-to. He did occasionally have some really unusual things, like in Tower of the Elephant, and also in Tower of the Elephant, he went in an interesting direction by having the elephant in Tower of the Elephant, this unusual transdimensional being nowhere near malevolent. I don't get any sense of malevolence from that character. He's just alien, and very much comprehensible. Whereas Lovecraft, there's no question. I mean, mind flayers are a Lovecraftian monster. And there's no question. Aboleths are a Lovecraftian monster. The influence of Lovecraft on the setting is in oozes and slimes. That's definitely something Lovecraft didn't like. Fish people, although of course deep ones were much more sinister than say the Lokatha or the Sea Elves, but and they're more insidious than the Sahagin. But there was the real sense of things from the sea being dangerous, and there's a real sense of him really loving to create monsters, and he was a great creator of monsters, and he was, from the point of view of world building, top tier. He's right there. He really is right there with Tolkien as a world builder, because he built a cosmology unlike very much unlike Robert E. Howard, or really even Clark Ashton Smith. Clark Ashton Smith was not really a world builder, which is part of the reason why he's probably not as big influence in Dungeons and Dragons. In fact, in Appendix N, I'm pretty sure. I'm pretty sure. I'm 100% sure that there's no Clark Ashton Smith in Appendix N, which seems like a glaring omission from our Gary Gygax. Appendix N, for those who don't know, is the Appendix N of the Dungeon Master's Guide, first edition, by Gary Gygax, by E. Gary Gygax, published in 1979. 77, 78, yeah, 79, because it was the last of the three, and each one came out a year apart. Monster Manual, Player's Handbook, Dungeon Master's Guide. But the Dungeon Master's Guide in Appendix N has Robert E. Howard and H.P. Lovecraft. Also, H.P. Lovecraft was a fantastic fantasy writer. His science fiction, horror stuff was excellent, but his fantasy stuff was excellent. He abandoned it later in his life because it was more difficult for him to do than his horror stuff. But his fantasy, his dreamlands are definitely an influence on the basically it's the one of the three types of created fantasy settings that I can think of. Most people who create fantasy settings either try to emulate or Tolkien, try and create an entirely created mythology and storyline, and they create their own gods and their own religions and their own fauna, flora, monster, how the monsters fit in and all that stuff. And then otherwise they create a kind of kitchen sink historical setting like Hyboria, or they create the kind of almost surreal, unusual setting like H.P. Lovecraft did, where the places have weird names, and there's no clear historical equivalent. There's and that's often the way people write or create their fantasy settings. This is true. I'm talking about in general about dungeon masters creating in fact, it's often the guys just going off and creating just weird stuff. I would say that my first attempts at my own world building much closer to H.P. Lovecraft's Dreamlands than they were to Middle Earth or the Hyborian world. But and I think I think their influence is pretty solid on those. But when it gets back to Clark Ashton Smith, his world building, he never really built a whole world. I don't really get a real sense of what, for example, Hyperborea was exactly like. You just get sketches of it. You get he's more poetic. He builds his world through impression. His world's more impressionistic. Even Zothique, which is probably the one that he has the most world building in, you do get a sense of the unusual and the truly exotic and the truly horrific world that Zothique is, but it's not as considered as the world that Tolkien and Robert E. Howard created. Anyway, I've waffled on quite a lot about these three, probably more than is necessary. I really don't know how much new stuff can be said about these three writers, since they're having a little bit of a revival right now, and I don't know that I have any particular special insights into any of them, but I love their work, and I'm more than happy to celebrate their work and say what exactly it is about them that I like, and that was an influence on me. And that's pretty much all I got for you today.